In the final accounting of the Second World War, justice was meant to be absolute. At Nuremberg and at Tokyo, the Allied powers placed the architects of aggression and atrocity on trial, exposing their crimes to the full, unflinching glare of international law. The world learned of the gas chambers of Auschwitz, the medical experiments of Dachau, and the forced labor camps of the Nazi regime. A new moral standard was forged in the fire of these revelations, a promise that such acts would never again be tolerated, and that their perpetrators would be held to account. But in the shadows of the post-war reconstruction of Japan, a different kind of accounting was taking place. A series of secret decisions were being made, bargains struck in quiet rooms, that would allow an entire apparatus of systematic human evil to vanish from the historical record. A story of horror that rivaled, and in some respects even exceeded, the depravity of the Nazi doctors was about to be deliberately and methodically buried, traded for the spoils of a new and looming conflict, the Cold War. This is the story of a place that was officially known as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Guangdong Army. To the local Chinese population, it was a place of terror from which no one ever returned. And to the men who worked within its walls, it had a simple, numeric designation, Unit 731. Within this compound, and its satellite facilities across occupied Manchuria, the Empire of Japan pursued a program of biological and chemical warfare of breathtaking ambition and almost unimaginable cruelty. The ultimate goal was to create weapons of mass destruction capable of annihilating entire cities and armies. And the raw material for this research, the test subjects for this grand experiment, would be human beings. This documentary is not based on rumor or speculation. It is built upon a foundation of declassified Allied intelligence files, the chilling, matter-of-fact testimony of the perpetrators themselves, and the excavated evidence from the sites of their crimes. We will tell the story of the thousands of Chinese, Soviet, Korean, and Allied prisoners of war who were subjected to live vivisection, systematic infection with plague and anthrax, and exposure to weapons in open-air field tests. We will then expose the even more disturbing epilogue, the story of how the United States government, in a cold, pragmatic calculation of national interest, made the decision to grant the doctors of Unit 731 full immunity from prosecution in exchange for their data, allowing the men who presided over this house of horrors to walk free. This is the story of a crime and a cover-up. The architect of this empire of suffering was a man whose ambition was matched only by his ruthlessness, Surgeon General Shiro Ishii. Ishii was a brilliant, politically astute, and morally vacant physician in the Imperial Japanese Army. From the early 1930s, he had been a fervent advocate for a Japanese biological weapons program, touring laboratories in Europe and convincing the highest echelons of the military, including the Minister of War, that germ warfare was the ultimate force multiplier. He argued that it was a cheap, effective, and terrifying weapon, perfectly suited for an empire that lacked the industrial resources of its Western rivals. Ishii's vision was not merely defensive, it was apocalyptic. He dreamed of plagues that could be unleashed on entire continents, of pathogens that could bring the United States to its knees without a single Japanese soldier ever having to land on its shores. In 1936, his lobbying paid off. The Japanese military granted him his charter, establishing a covert unit deep in the puppet state of Manchukuo, in occupied northeast China. The location was chosen with cold, deliberate calculation. It was remote, far from the prying eyes of international observers. It was close to the border with the Soviet Union, Japan's primary strategic obsession. And most importantly, it had a vast, captive, and entirely disposable local population that could be harvested for experimental material. The unit began its life under a series of innocuous names, but its dark heart was always the same, a relentless, state-sanctioned program of human experimentation, justified under the banner of national defense and imperial destiny. The central facility, constructed in the Pingfang district outside the city of Harbin, was a monument to industrialized evil. It was a massive, sprawling complex of over 150 buildings, complete with its own airfield, railway line, and crematoria. To the outside world, it was presented as a lumber mill. But inside its heavily guarded walls was a city of science dedicated to the study and weaponization of death. It contained vast breeding facilities capable of producing billions of plague-infested fleas per month. It housed laboratories for cultivating anthrax, cholera, typhoid, and gas gangrene on an industrial scale. And at its center was a complex of prisons and laboratories, designated Buildings 7 and 8, which served as the human holding pens and the dissection rooms. The test subjects for Ishii's experiments were drawn from the surrounding population and from captured enemy soldiers. They were Chinese resistance fighters, common criminals, intellectuals, and sometimes entire families, including women and children, who had been rounded up by the Kempeitai, the Japanese military police. Within the walls of Unit 731, these human beings were systematically stripped of their identity. They were assigned a number and referred to by a single, chilling euphemism, Maryuta, the Japanese word for logs. This dehumanization was total and essential. It allowed the doctors, scientists, and technicians of Unit 731, many of them graduates of Japan's most prestigious medical universities, to perform acts of unspeakable cruelty while viewing them as nothing more than the dissection of raw material, the logging of timber for the construction of an imperial war machine. The scientific process within the walls of Unit 731 was a grotesque parody of legitimate research, a perversion of the medical oath where the objective was not to heal, but to perfect the mechanics of death. The methodology was systematic, organized, and meticulously documented. For the thousands of men, women, and children who were brought to the facility, the process was unvaried and inescapable. Upon arrival, they were fed and their health was stabilized, not out of any sense of compassion, but to ensure that they were a pure, uncontaminated baseline for the experiments to come. The fate of every log, whether they survived for a week or for several months, was the same: dissection and incineration. No one was ever meant to leave. The primary research centered on bacteriological warfare. Prisoners were deliberately infected with a horrifying array of pathogens to study the full progression of human disease. They were given food injected with typhoid or cholera. They were forced to drink contaminated water. In the plague studies, prisoners were herded into chambers where they were swarmed by fleas that had been fed on plague-infected rats. The doctors and scientists would then observe, with scientific detachment, the onset of the symptoms: the raging fever, the grotesque swelling of the lymph nodes, the agonizing descent into delirium and death. To gather the freshest possible data, vivisections were performed on conscious subjects, often without anesthesia. The researchers believed that the process of decomposition after death would alter the state of the organs, and so, to get the purest results, they would dissect their victims while they were still alive. The research extended far beyond the study of disease into the limits of human endurance. In the frostbite experiments, prisoners were taken outside in the brutal Manchurian winter, their limbs exposed and periodically doused with water until they were frozen solid. A technician would walk along the line of subjects, tapping their frozen arms with a short stick. A senior researcher later testified that when the limb was fully frozen, it would make a sound like a block of wood. The prisoners were then brought inside, where different methods of thawing were attempted, not to save the victim, but to study the effects of rot and gangrene on living tissue. All of this research had a clear, operational objective: to turn these diseases and injuries into weapons. In open-air field tests, prisoners were tied to stakes arranged in concentric circles around a target point. Japanese aircraft would then drop prototype bombs designed to shatter and spray porcelain shards filled with anthrax or plague-infested fleas over the human targets. Other prisoners were used to test the effectiveness of flamethrowers or chemical agents. In every case, the objective was the same: to observe, to document, and to refine the technology of mass murder, using living human bodies as little more than sentient laboratory equipment. It was a production line of death, meticulously documented at every stage. The horrors perpetrated within the Pingfang compound were not an end in themselves. They were merely the research and development phase of a far larger, more terrifying ambition. The purpose of every vivisection, every induced infection, and every frostbite study was the creation of a new and devastating arsenal. Shiro Ishii and the Japanese High Command did not see Unit 731 as a mere laboratory. They saw it as the heart of a revolutionary new form of warfare. Its meticulously documented atrocities were the production line for weapons designed to be deployed against civilian populations on a massive, strategic scale. The final product of this human suffering was a sophisticated and varied array of bacteriological and chemical weapons, ready for battlefield application. The primary delivery systems were aerial bombs, but they were unlike any conventional ordnance. The scientists of Unit 731 developed specialized ceramic, or porcelain, bombs, most famously the Uji bomb. These weapons were not designed for explosive force. Their fragile casings were engineered to shatter upon impact, releasing their contents as a fine, aerosolized mist of deadly pathogens over a wide area. The use of ceramic instead of metal was a deliberate and cunning choice. It ensured maximum fragmentation for dispersing the biological agent and made the unexploded bomblets incredibly difficult to locate and clean up. These bombs were filled with anthrax, typhoid, cholera, and other virulent agents cultivated in the laboratories. Another key weapon was even more insidious: the direct dispersal of plague-infested fleas. The vast breeding facilities at Pingfang produced billions of fleas, which were fed on plague-infected rats. These fleas were then mixed with a medium like grain or cotton and packed into containers designed to be dropped from low-flying aircraft, showering the silent, unseen agents of the Black Death over entire communities. Beginning in 1940, the Japanese military began to systematically use these weapons against the Chinese. These were not isolated trials. They were sustained campaigns of biological warfare, turning vast swathes of the Chinese countryside and its cities into a giant, open-air laboratory. In October of 1940, Japanese aircraft flew over the city of Ningbo, dropping wheat and cotton scraps teeming with plague-infested fleas. Days later, a horrifying outbreak of bubonic plague, a disease that had not been seen in the region, erupted among the civilian population. Similar attacks were launched against the city of Chengde and numerous other towns and villages in Zhejiang and Hunan provinces. The goal was not to destroy buildings, but to terrorize the population and cripple the social fabric by introducing incomprehensible, invisible death. Beyond aerial attacks, the operatives of Unit 731 engaged in a campaign of direct contamination. They systematically poisoned wells, reservoirs, and rivers with cholera and typhoid bacilli, seeking to contaminate the water supply of entire regions. They baked poisoned buns and distributed them to unsuspecting civilians and prisoners. The total death toll from these biological warfare campaigns is impossible to calculate with certainty, but conservative estimates, based on Chinese and Allied records, place the number of victims well into the hundreds of thousands. To the Japanese military command, these operations were a stunning success. They proved that biological weapons were a viable, low-cost method for destabilizing and terrorizing a vast nation. But these campaigns in China, for all their horror, were merely a dress rehearsal. They were the field tests for the ultimate application of Ishii's work, a planned biological attack against the United States itself. By 1944, as the tide of the Pacific War turned irrevocably against Japan, the work of Shiro Ishii and Unit 731 took on a new and terrifying urgency. The steady, island-hopping advance of the American military brought the Japanese home islands themselves within range of Allied bombers, creating a level of national desperation that pushed the most extreme and apocalyptic plans to the forefront. For the Japanese High Command, the bacteriological weapons perfected in the laboratories of Pingfang were no longer just a tool for terrorizing China. They were now seen as a potential last-ditch, war-winning superweapon, a way to inflict such a devastating and horrifying blow upon the American mainland that the United States would be forced to sue for peace. This was the genesis of Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night. The plan was a suicide mission of almost unimaginable horror, a fusion of Japan's most fanatical tactical innovation, the kamikaze, with its most secret and depraved scientific program. The concept was chillingly straightforward. A large, I-400 class long-range submarine, a vessel capable of carrying multiple aircraft and reaching the west coast of the United States undetected, would be dispatched across the Pacific. Its aircraft would not be armed with conventional bombs or torpedoes. Instead, their payloads would be canisters filled with billions of plague-infested fleas, cultivated in the vast breeding facilities of Unit 731. The target was Southern California. The aircraft, flown by kamikaze pilots, would launch at night and fly inland, dispersing their silent, deadly cargo over the sprawling, densely populated cities of San Diego and Los Angeles. The strategic thinking behind this plan was rooted in a profound psychological and biological calculation. The Japanese knew that the United States had no significant natural immunity to the bubonic plague. An outbreak on the scale envisioned by this attack would be catastrophic, creating a public health crisis of unprecedented proportions. It would induce a level of mass panic and terror that, they believed, the American civilian population was psychologically unprepared to handle. It was a plan to turn America's own cities into a massive open-air plague ward, a move so horrific that it would shatter American morale and cripple their ability to continue prosecuting the war. The plan was not a fantasy. It was fully approved by the Imperial General Headquarters and was scheduled to be launched in the final months of the war, with a target date of September 22, 1945. Preparations were in their final stages. The submarines were being readied, the pilots were selected, and the biological agents were being prepared for transport. The only thing that prevented the execution of Operation Cherry Blossoms at night was Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, following the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The United States, in its deployment of a new and terrible weapon of mass destruction, had unknowingly preempted the deployment of an even more insidious and potentially uncontrollable one. The world was spared a biological catastrophe of unimaginable scale by a matter of weeks, a silent, terrifying postscript to a war that was already the most destructive in human history. In the final chaotic days of the war in the Pacific, as the Soviet Union launched its surprise invasion of Manchuria on August 9, 1945, a different kind of operation was set in motion at the Pingfang compound. It was not an attack, but a frantic, systematic, and utterly ruthless campaign of destruction and concealment. For Shiro Ishii and the leadership of Unit 731, the sudden collapse of the Guangdong Army meant that their secret world was about to be overrun by the Red Army. The highest priority was no longer the creation of weapons, but the complete and total eradication of all evidence of their crimes. What followed was a week of calculated demolition and mass murder, a final, reflexive act of depravity designed to ensure that the story of Unit 731 would die with its victims. The first and most horrific step was the liquidation of the remaining Maryuta. Over the course of several days, the last several hundred prisoners still alive within the compound's holding cells were systematically murdered. They were gassed, poisoned with cyanide, or shot. Their bodies were immediately taken to the massive crematoria that ran day and night, their ashes to be scattered in the nearby Songhua River. Ishii's order was absolute. Not a single living test subject was to be allowed to fall into Soviet hands. These prisoners were the living proof of the unit's crimes, and their testimony could have condemned every doctor and researcher to the gallows. Their final silent moments were consumed by the same cold, pragmatic logic that had governed their entire ordeal. They were evidence to be disposed of. Simultaneously, a frantic effort was made to destroy the physical infrastructure of the unit. The most incriminating buildings, particularly the prisons and the vivisection laboratories in Blocks 7 and 8, were dynamited. Vast pits were dug, and tons of research documents, laboratory equipment, and pathological samples were dumped into them and incinerated. However, in their haste to escape the advancing Soviet tanks, the demolition was incomplete. The crematoria, the railway sidings, and the foundations of the main buildings remained, a skeletal ruin that would one day offer mute testimony to the horrors that had transpired there. While the compound burned, Ishii orchestrated the escape of his most important assets, his staff and his data. He arranged for special trains to evacuate the several thousand Japanese doctors, scientists and technicians, along with their families, back to the relative safety of Korea and eventually to Japan. He issued a chilling final order to his men: take the secret to your graves. He forbade them from ever speaking of their work at Pingfang and from taking any post-war employment in the public sector that might draw attention to them. As a final act, he allegedly staged his own funeral, hoping to vanish from the world stage and escape the justice he knew was coming. The doctors of Unit 731, carrying the secrets of their unspeakable research in their minds, melted back into the civilian population of a defeated Japan, leaving behind nothing but scorched earth, mass graves, and the ghosts of thousands of nameless victims. In the immediate aftermath of Japan's surrender, as American occupation forces under General Douglas MacArthur began the monumental task of rebuilding a shattered nation, a new and far more insidious front in the war began to take shape: the war for intelligence. The United States was already looking past the smoldering ruins of the Second World War to the new, looming threat of the Soviet Union. In this nascent Cold War, every scrap of advanced military research, every scientific advantage, became a strategic asset of incalculable value. It was within this cold, pragmatic, and morally ambiguous new reality that the fate of Shiro Ishii and the perpetrators of Unit 731 would be decided, not in a courtroom, but in the back channels of military intelligence. American intelligence was not ignorant of Ishii's activities. As early as 1944, reports had begun to filter in from Allied intelligence operatives in China about a possible Japanese biological warfare program. Following the surrender, American investigators, led by scientists from Fort Detrick, the center of the U.S. Army's own biological weapons program, were dispatched to Japan with the highest priority: to find Shiro Ishii and to uncover the full extent of his research. When Ishii, whose faked death had been quickly exposed, was finally located and taken into custody in 1946, a chilling series of interrogations began. What the American investigators heard in these secret debriefings was both horrifying and, to them, scientifically priceless. Ishii and his top lieutenants, realizing they were cornered, decided to play the only card they had left. They offered a full, unvarnished confession of their activities, but with a condition. They would turn over their complete research findings, 8,000 slides of human pathology, detailed reports on the effects of plague, anthrax and cholera on human beings, and the full data from their open-air weapons tests, in exchange for one thing: full and complete immunity from prosecution as war criminals for every single member of Unit 731. The American intelligence officers and the scientists from Fort Detrick were faced with a stark and terrible choice. The information Ishii was offering was a scientific holy grail. It was a complete, detailed record of human experimentation on a scale that had never been seen before, data that American researchers could never hope to replicate through animal testing. To the men in charge of America's burgeoning biological weapons program, this was a quantum leap, a way to save years of research and millions of dollars. The moral cost, however, was immense. To accept the deal would be to knowingly and deliberately shield mass murderers from justice, a direct violation of the very principles of international law that the United States was simultaneously championing at the war crimes tribunals in Tokyo and Nuremberg. The decision was sent up the chain of command, from MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo to the highest levels of the War Department in Washington. The final verdict was as swift as it was secret. In a series of classified telegrams, the Joint Chiefs of Staff made their position clear. The value of the Japanese biological warfare data was deemed to be of such utmost importance to the security of the United States that it far outweighed the value of prosecuting the men who had generated it. The deal was approved. Shiro Ishii and his entire staff of doctors, the men who had presided over the vivisection and systematic murder of thousands of human beings, were about to receive a full and secret pardon from the very nation that had just defeated their empire. The execution of the cover-up was a masterclass in bureaucratic deceit and misdirection, an operation of cynical efficiency conducted in the shadows while the public spectacle of the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal captured the world's attention. The American government's primary objective was twofold. First, to extract every last piece of data from Ishii and his subordinates, and second, to ensure that the story of Unit 731 never became public, a task made all the more urgent by the fact that the Soviet Union, having captured some lower-level members of the unit in Manchuria, was beginning to make its own inquiries. The United States was determined to monopolize the intelligence and to prevent the Soviets from using the atrocities for a propaganda victory. The process of debriefing the Japanese doctors was methodical. Over the course of 1947, American scientists from Fort Detrick conducted extensive interviews, compiling a series of detailed, top-secret reports. These documents, which have since been declassified, are chilling in their cold, scientific tone. They are filled with pages of data on human infection rates, lethal dosage levels for various pathogens, and the pathology of organs taken from vivisected prisoners, all stripped of any moral commentary. The American scientists, in their own reports, noted the unique value of the data, stating that such information could not be obtained in our own laboratories because of the scruples attached to human experimentation. It was a quiet, bureaucratic admission of the profound moral compromise they were making. While the data was being extracted, a parallel effort was underway to scrub the official record. American prosecutors at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East in Tokyo were given explicit instructions from Washington to grant off-the-record immunity to all members of the Japanese bacteriological warfare program. Any mention of Unit 731 was to be suppressed. When Soviet prosecutors, who were conducting their own trial of captured Unit 731 personnel at Khabarovsk, attempted to introduce evidence of Japanese war crimes related to germ warfare at the Tokyo Tribunal, their requests were systematically stonewalled by the American authorities, who dismissed the Soviet claims as communist propaganda. The deception was total. The names of Shiro Ishii and his key lieutenants never appeared on any list of war criminals. The thousands of victims of Pingfang were rendered invisible, their suffering erased from the official history of the conflict as a matter of state policy. In exchange for their cooperation, the men who had perfected the art of mass murder were given a quiet, unwritten pardon. They were released from custody and allowed to melt back into Japanese society, their horrific secrets secured by the government of their former enemy. The United States had obtained its priceless data, the Soviets had been denied their propaganda coup, and the curtain of silence had been successfully drawn across one of the darkest chapters of the entire Second World War. Justice had not just been denied, it had been actively and successfully subverted. For the men of Unit 731, the years following their secret amnesty were not a period of quiet, shame-filled obscurity. On the contrary, armed with the tacit protection of the American occupation authorities and the enduring respect of a Japanese society desperate to rebuild, many of Ishii's most senior researchers and doctors went on to lead remarkably successful and prominent careers. They became deans of medical schools, heads of pharmaceutical companies, and esteemed members of academic societies. The very men who had honed their surgical skills on living unanesthetized prisoners now became pillars of the post-war Japanese medical and scientific establishment, their pasts laundered by the silence of their victims and the complicity of their former enemies. The list of their post-war successes is as shocking as the list of their wartime crimes. Masaji Kitano, a key commander at Unit 731, became the head of Green Cross, one of Japan's largest pharmaceutical corporations. Heisei Nato, who had worked on the development of plague bombs, went on to lead the Japan Blood Bank. Other members of the unit became prominent figures at the Japanese National Institute of Health, founded under American occupation, or took up prestigious professorships at the very same elite universities from which they had been recruited years earlier. They published papers, they taught generations of new doctors, and they grew old, surrounded by the comforts and respectability their crimes should have denied them. Shiro Ishii himself, the architect of the entire program, never faced a day in court. After his debriefing by the Americans, he was released and lived out the rest of his life in relative comfort, occasionally visited by his American contacts from Fort Detrick. He died of throat cancer in 1959, a free man, his secrets and his crimes still largely unknown to the world. For decades, the story of Unit 731 was relegated to the fringes, dismissed in the West as Soviet propaganda and actively suppressed in Japan as a topic of shame that threatened the nation's carefully reconstructed post-war identity. The silence finally began to break in the 1980s, when a courageous Japanese journalist and historian, Seiichi Morimura, published a groundbreaking and horrifying exposé titled The Devil's Gluttony. His work, combined with the gradual declassification of American intelligence files and the growing willingness of a few aging, guilt-ridden members of the unit to speak, finally began to drag the horrific truth into the light. But by then, it was too late for justice. The perpetrators were old, or already dead. The victims were long since turned to ash. The cover-up, for all intents and purposes, had been a stunning success. It had allowed an entire generation of war criminals to escape justice, to live prosperous lives, and to die in peace, a final, chilling testament to the cold, pragmatic calculus of post-war geopolitics. In the decades following the Second World War, the legacy of Unit 731 has festered like a hidden wound, a toxic combination of unacknowledged atrocity and geopolitical cynicism. Its impact extends far beyond the thousands of victims who were directly murdered in its laboratories. The program's existence, and its subsequent cover-up, has cast a long and deeply poisonous shadow over the fields of international law, medical ethics, and the relationship between the major powers of East Asia. The story did not end with the death of Shiro Ishii. In many ways, it was only beginning. For the victims, and particularly for China, the legacy is one of profound and unresolved injustice. The biological warfare campaigns launched from Pingfang, the deliberate spreading of plague and cholera, left a devastating mark on the Chinese population, causing epidemics that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians and lingered in some communities for years after the war had ended. The fact that not a single member of the unit was ever prosecuted for these acts at the Tokyo Tribunal remains a source of deep and abiding bitterness, a symbol of a justice that was selectively applied, where the suffering of Asian victims was deemed less significant than the suffering of Europeans. This historical grievance continues to be a major point of friction in Sino-Japanese relations to this day, a ghost of the past that refuses to be exorcised. For the United States, the legacy is one of enduring moral compromise. The decision to sacrifice justice for intelligence, while perhaps understandable in the cold, paranoid dawn of the nuclear age, stands as one of the most troubling ethical bargains in modern American history. The data obtained from Unit 731 did, in fact, contribute to the development of the American biological weapons program at Fort Detrick, a program that would expand dramatically during the Cold War. In a very real and direct way, the American bioweapons arsenal was built upon a foundation of data generated through the systematic torture and murder of Allied, Soviet, and Chinese citizens. It is a dark inheritance, a stark reminder that in the pursuit of national security, the line between pragmatism and complicity can become terrifyingly blurred. Furthermore, the American cover-up had a chilling, unintended consequence. By suppressing the evidence of Japan's biological warfare program and preventing a full, public prosecution, the United States inadvertently created a vacuum of accountability. It allowed the Japanese government, for decades, to officially deny the very existence of Unit 731, dismissing it as a historical fabrication. This official denialism has only recently begun to crumble under the overwhelming weight of academic research and the testimony of former participants. The failure to prosecute in 1947 ensured that the quest for historical truth would become a bitter, prolonged, and painful battle, a fight over the very memory of the war that continues to echo into the 21st century. In the final, stark analysis, the story of Unit 731 forces us to confront a series of deeply uncomfortable and challenging truths. It is a narrative that resists easy categorization, a story of an evil so profound that it seems to defy comprehension, followed by a cover-up so clinical and pragmatic that it challenges our most cherished notions of post-war justice. It is a story that reveals the terrifying capacity of human beings, in the pursuit of a perceived greater good, be it imperial destiny or national security, to systematically abandon every principle of law, morality, and shared humanity. The first and most elemental truth of Unit 731 is its demonstration of the terrifying power of dehumanization. The entire operation, from its inception to its bloody conclusion, was predicated on the ability of its doctors and scientists to cease viewing their victims as human beings. The term Maryuta, or logs, was not merely a slang term, it was the central organizing principle of the entire program. It was a psychological tool that allowed educated civilized men to perform acts of unimaginable cruelty, not as sadists, but as scientists collecting data from an inert resource. It is a chilling testament to the fact that the greatest atrocities in history are often committed not in a fit of rage, but in an atmosphere of cold, bureaucratic, and scientifically rationalized detachment. The second truth, and in many ways the more disturbing for a modern audience, lies in the American response. The cover-up of Unit 731 was not an act of passion or revenge. It was a cold, calculated decision made by rational, intelligent men who had weighed the options and concluded that the acquisition of scientific data was more important than the prosecution of mass murderers. It is a story that forces us to question the very nature of justice in a world governed by geopolitical rivalry. It suggests that in the high-stakes game of international power politics, even the most sacred principles, such as accountability for crimes against humanity, can become expendable commodities, pieces to be traded in the pursuit of a strategic advantage. This narrative shatters the clean, heroic arc of the good war. It introduces a profound and deeply troubling shade of gray into a conflict that is so often painted in the stark colors of black and white. It reveals that the line between victim and perpetrator, between hero and accomplice, can sometimes be drawn not by a moral compass, but by the dispassionate logic of national interest. The story of Unit 731 does not diminish the evil of the Nazi regime or the justice of the Allied cause, but it adds a deeply unsettling and necessary layer of complexity to our understanding of the war's aftermath. It serves as a permanent, cautionary tale of the dark bargains that can be struck when the pursuit of power is divorced from the principles of justice. Why, then, must a story of such profound darkness be told? Why must we force ourselves to look into this abyss, to confront a narrative that offers no redemption, no heroes, and no satisfying resolution? We must tell the story of Unit 731 precisely because it is a story of ghosts. It is a story of the ghosts of thousands of victims whose names we will never know, whose suffering was deliberately erased from the ledger of history, and whose memory demands a reckoning. To allow their story to remain buried under the weight of Cold War secrecy and national shame is to grant a final, posthumous victory to the men who saw them not as humans, but as logs to be burned. We must also tell this story because of the ghosts it left among the perpetrators. The men of Unit 731 were not held to account. They were not forced to confront their crimes in a court of law. And because of this, the poison of their ideology and their unexamined past was allowed to seep back into the foundations of post-war Japanese society. The failure of justice was also a failure of national catharsis, a refusal to lance a wound that has continued to fester for generations. The ongoing debates and denials surrounding Japan's wartime history are a direct legacy of the silence that was so carefully constructed around Unit 731 in 1947. But the most important reason to tell this story is for ourselves. It is a story that acts as a terrible and necessary mirror. It forces us to confront the terrifying ease with which science can be divorced from morality, the speed with which human beings can be reduced to data points, and the seductive logic of strategic necessity that can be used to justify the most monstrous of acts. The story of Unit 731 is not just a Japanese story, and its cover-up is not just an American one. It is a universal human story about our capacity for both profound cruelty and profound, cynical indifference. In the end, the history of Unit 731 is a stark and brutal reminder that the pursuit of knowledge without conscience is the most dangerous force on Earth. It stands as a permanent, indelible warning that the first and most crucial line of defense against atrocity is not a treaty or a law, but the simple, unwavering insistence on the shared humanity of every single person. To forget the victims of Pingfang is to forget this essential truth. And in a world that is still grappling with the dark potential of science and the brutal logic of power, that is a truth we can never, ever afford to forget.